All right, I guess we'll start then. The lecture this time is about archetypes and intertextuality. I'll first talk about archetypes in the Jungian perspective. Then I'll talk about intertextuality and then about why I think these concepts should be examined in relationship to one another. All right. This man here is Carl Gustav Jung, and he came up with the idea of archetypes in a way. To be more precise, he came up with archetypes in connection with the unconscious and examined them. The way he arrived at this conclusion was that he examined mythology and religion and observed that there are patterns in these stories that are kind of the same, and he broke them down to these archetypical figures. The most important, the most interesting ones for us this time are certain archetypical figures that he examined in different mythologies and religions, and that they have a great influence on his way of seeing the human mind or his theories of analytical psychology. All right. The basis of his archetypes is that these gods that were created, or these archetypical figures in a story, have a certain psychological gain for a person that thinks in these categories. So in a way, if you have a certain god that stands for something, you gain from this figure something for your life. For example, if you imagine a primitive man, and this man comes up with the idea of a weather god, the domain of weather will be encapsulated by this god, so you have something to think of when you think of weather. So all those rituals that people came up with to kind of give something to the weather gods or to attain something from the weather gods are part of this domain. So you start winning this domain over by coming up with the idea of a god or encapsulating the domain with a god. All right, we move on then to his idea of the mind. It's really complex, so we have different planes. The first plane is the yellow one on the top. It's the outer world, so that which we perceive. We interact with the outer world most of the times with the persona. I don't know if you can read it. It's kind of a social mask we put on. This mask we put on obviously for like social acceptance and so that we can interact with other people, and social conventions play a huge role in this interaction. So it's there for social flexibility. But also on the negative side, that is something that Carl Jung does a lot of times. All these concepts on here have a kind of positive side and a negative side. In his words, he described this as positive and negative mana. Yeah, and the negative side of a persona is basically that you are intrigued to over-identify yourself with this persona. There's this passage in Being and Nothingness by Sartre where he describes a waiter, and he's sitting in this cafe, and this waiter is too much of a waiter. So he watched this waiter going to the tables and bowing too quickly and too much, and it's all unnatural. And Sartre observes this and he says, why is this person first a waiter and then his own individual identity? And that is basically why, like, the negative side of this persona identity. All right, then we move on to the ego. That is basically what thinks, that is the voice that thinks in your head. So the ego is that which we identify ourselves with to like the biggest degree, I guess. Then we have this other plane, it's the personal unconscious, and the last plane, this like purple one at the bottom, is the collective unconscious. Unlike Freud, who had a different model, Jung made a model of the unconscious that is distributed in a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. In the personal unconscious, there are things that play a huge role for your unconscious. So basically, if we have complexes here that are created through the outer world, so if you, for example, have some mama issues, then they will be represented in the personal unconscious. Or if you have other complexes, like some kind of tics or whatever, they are inside of the domain of the personal unconscious. The collective unconscious is reserved to archetypes, and the idea behind this is basically that every human being has a collective unconscious, and we all share this collective unconscious to a certain degree. So basically, when he observed all these archetypal figures in mythology and religion, he thought that they were part of the collective unconscious, and that is why they were inside of every human being, or that was his explanation why mythology of like India is so much alike mythology of other countries. All right, then we have other entities to go through. We have the anima and the animus. Those are basically the guides that are represented in your dreams that pull you to the unconscious material that your collective unconscious is trying to tell you. So if you dream and there is this kind of woman standing there and she's like, I don't know, signaling you to come to her or to come with her, or she's even pulling you somewhere, it's usually this anima character, and she's trying to make you aware of what the unconscious is trying to tell you, or what the collective unconscious is trying to tell you. In a way, those are mainly opposite sex relationships in people who are heterosexual in a way. The idea basically is that the sex that you desire is the one that will be able to guide you to where it wants to guide you, or to where the collective unconscious wants you to go. There's also this category in literature when we have this really like goddess-like character that all the other characters are crushing on or interested in. It's probably kind of inside of this domain. And then we have the shadow, which is also part of the personal unconscious, and it's the dark side of your character, basically. So in the ego, we have all these traits that you have, and there are traits about you as a human being you don't really like or you don't want to admit to, and those are encapsulated in the shadow domain. So basically, you don't want to lie, but your shadow, in a way, is this deceitful, deceiving character that doesn't mind lying at all. It's like all those dark secrets you don't want to admit, they are suppressed by your conscious mind into this shadow character. So if you dream and there's a character you really, really don't like, there's a high probability that that is basically your shadow, because it's those parts of yourself that your conscious is trying to suppress or kind of lie away in a way. All right, then we'll move on into the collective unconscious and talk about the archetypes, and we'll do that examining every archetype by itself. We'll start off by the eternal child. I've put you some pictures of, or images of really like popular representations of this archetype. You may be wondering why I put on Michael Jackson, but there is a very famous interview where Michael Jackson actually says that he feels he is Peter Pan. So he's a trapped child in a grown man's body. And that is also the reason why he called his huge mansion the Neverland Ranch, because Neverland was the land where Peter Pan was living. Obviously, Peter Pan is also on there because Peter Pan is obviously the eternal child that doesn't want to grow up and wants to be a child forever. There's also a really negative side to this. I've put it on the bottom. I mean, obviously, there's a positive and negative side, as I've already said. That is what Jung is doing. The positive side is Simba here. Simba signifies inside the narrative of the Lion King, this eternal child character of personal growth that still can grow into anything and will eventually grow into this very nice king that will lead to the nice life of all the animals that are part of the Lion King story. And the negative side is obviously Peter Pan, Michael Jackson. And the article I put down here, the article says that number of young adults living with parents reaches record high. So we have grown people that don't want to move out of their parents' houses because they don't want to challenge life in a way. And that is the negative part of this eternal child, or this archetype of children in the dream theory of Carl Jung. All right, then we move on. Then we have the Great Mother. I've put some examples on here again. And the Great Mother is the kind of representation of the state of nature in the collective unconscious of people. So nature is associated with chaos to some degree and a natural order that we do not comprehend yet. The counter image or the counter imagery to this is the Great Father, and the Great Father is there to impose his own order on things. All right, but now we're going to examine the Great Mother a little bit more. The positive side of the Great Mother is obviously that she gives life, she sustains you, she gives you food, she gives you love, she gives you basically everything that you need. But the negative side of this is obviously that you can become too dependent on her. I mean, on one side, it's that you can depend too much on your own mother, that you're kind of living off her breast, but you're not able to move out of her house, basically. But the other side of her character can be that she is in herself evil. That is represented by the evil witch or the jealous queen. So we have basically these mother characters who are in themselves corrupted to be evil in a way. And that is the negative side of this imagery. And in the dream theory of Carl Jung, these images are always interconnected. His theory basically says that archetypes are represented through certain symbols, and these symbols are to be interpreted by the person who is dreaming, but they can also always change. So if you start dreaming and you have this Great Mother character and she's like nurturing you and everything is great, she's like giving you life and you feel really, really good. But in the next moment, this whole imagery can shift and she can become this really, really evil witch that you have grown to be codependent on, and you can't really get away from it anymore because you're so accustomed to it. All right, then I've also put this image here on of, okay, it's not working, but it's all right, of fate. It's the 3 fate characters in Greek mythology. One of the women there is there to measure the length of your soul, basically, which stands for how long you're able to live. And the other one is there to produce this like fate of you, and the third one is there to cut it. And this imagery kind of encapsulates this whole movement through the different characters of the Great Mother. So one is there to produce your life, basically. One is there to measure it, so that's like the healthy amount of like the distance of you and your mother, and that there will be a certain point in which you are to grow as a human being and go away from your mother. And then also there's the third mother in this representation that cuts away your life and basically decides when you're going to die, which is obviously the evil Great Mother or the evil witch. All right, then we have the Great Father. I've put some images on there again. You're probably wondering why I put Noam Chomsky on there. Noam Chomsky famously said in an interview after he had some kind of lecture or speech here to the question of one student that asked him if he's actually like all-knowing or if he has the answer for a certain problem. And he said, well, he would like to be this like great father and wise old man and whatever, but obviously he doesn't know everything, and those people who are asking him questions like that should just go home and think about things themselves, because he obviously is not all-knowing and can't answer every question. All right, so the positive aspect I've already talked about to some degree of the Great Father is that he creates order. He creates order in different mediums of representation. So it's like political order, but also psychological order, social order, etc. But there's also the aspect of the wise old man who mentors his pupils in a way. The example of that is Merlin here. Merlin gets the student and mentors him, tells him all those secrets. And Merlin himself is obviously a powerful wizard who could just change the world and make everything great, but he chooses to be the mentor for somebody else and turn that person into a hero. All right. And then there are those other 2 paintings that you can probably see. Those are both of Saturn devouring his son. So that is the most extreme example of a bad or evil great father. The myth is basically Saturn is told that one of his sons will eventually start a revolution and kill him and overthrow him as a god, and he will lose his place of power. So the only thing that, of course, Saturn is going to do is eat his own sons. And one of them, ironically, gets away because the mother hides it. So we have this great mother, and it's obviously a nice one because she saves her child. And one of the sons gets away and then later comes back after a long time, has grown, has become this perfect hero, and then basically slays the father and kills him, and the prophecy happens as it was told. All right, then we have the Trickster, which is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting ones because it encapsulates this moving characters of archetypes really, really well. So I've put some examples on here. I think the only arguably good one here is of the Weasley twins from Harry Potter. I mean, they are mischieving, they do things that are not within social convention. They're kind of revolting against the order that is imposed on them, but they're not revolting against the good order in a way. They're revolting within goods, within realms of well-being of everyone, basically. So when they're revolting, they're actually making the people around them happy, which is basically the best possible trickster you could wish for. And the other ones, not so much. I mean, Cheshire Cat is kind of neutral in a way. It depends on which situation you look at. But the trickster here is not controlling everything, or not obviously, and it's not 100% bad. Joker, on the other hand, is probably arguably really, really bad. And I've also put Loki on here because in Norse mythology, Loki is the mischieving trickster. And the most interesting thing about Loki in Norse mythology is that he can actually shapeshift. So he can turn himself into a woman or whatever he wishes to. And that is kind of interesting for the trickster to be a shapeshifter, because that basically makes him the ultimate trickster, the ultimate prankster. Yeah. All right, then we move on and kind of, or will apply these categories to the reading of a certain story. And I've chosen Pokemon because normally you would think, okay, it's like a children's show. What do archetypes have to do with Pokemon? But I hope that I will prove to you that this actually makes a lot of sense. So we'll break down Pokemon in a lot of steps and see what the categories of Carl Jung will bring us. All right, so first of all, Pokemon is the most archetypical story ever. It's the hero journey. The hero is obviously Ash Ketchum. Then we go through all these steps. So there's a call to adventure. Professor Oak is telling him, hey, go catch all the Pokemon there are. Then there is supernatural aid. I think I don't have to explain what the supernatural aid here is because it's obviously the Pokemons themselves. Then there is a threshold or guardian. That guardian is obviously his mother. He has to convince his mother to be let go as a, I don't know, like 12-year-old to go into the unknown world and do whatever he wants. And this character is really interesting, his mother, because she is kind of the threshold of the known world. And after he kind of convinces his mother to go out, it's the unknown world for him and also for the reader, because the reader or the person watching Pokemon doesn't know what is coming next, because we've already seen that the supernatural aid is there, so it's a supernatural world, obviously. All right, then we get helpers, Rock and Misty, obviously. The mentor is the same person that gives the call to adventure, which is Professor Oak. And then they have helpers on the way, and then at some point he loses in some kind of battle, but that is not important. I will just move on, but this kind of like circle here is perfectly in sync with what happens with the Pokemon story. All right, then we will examine the kind of archetypical categories that are at play here. And the archetypical category, or the first archetypical category that I want to talk about is his rival, and his rival is obviously his shadow. Because his rival, Gary, has all the personality traits that are underdeveloped in Ash Ketchum. So Gary is this kind of show-off. He gets all the ladies through the whole thing, which kind of doesn't make sense at all, because he's also like a 12-year-old, and all these women are driving him around in the car, and it doesn't make sense in any way, but it is this kind of quality that Ash could have if he developed it. So we have in this shadow a few qualities that are kind of good or wishful that Ash could wish for, So, for example, if he would like to be great with the ladies, which he is obviously not, because all the ladies just run away from him at the end of the season and he doesn't even get that they actually like him. Yeah, and Gary is this counterpart to his psyche in a way. So if we go on reading Pokemon like this, we also have to think about the Pokemon themselves. And that is where the call to adventure comes to play again, because the call to adventure for Ash is to catch all the Pokemon. So what does that mean in a Jungian reading? So his challenge is basically to map out the unknown for his own conscience. So basically all the Pokemons are a challenge he is not yet aware of. And that is also where the Pokédex comes into play, because the Pokédex is basically where all the Pokemons he has caught will be inscribed upon. So he has challenge after challenge after challenge, and all those challenges after he masters them will be saved in this book. And this book, or the Pokédex, is obviously his psyche. So the next time he faces the same challenge that he has to face before, he will be able to do it, because in the Pokédex there's all the information he will need to do it. So every time he catches a Pokemon, in the Pokédex there will be all the information he needs to know the next time he faces this same Pokemon. The same goes for if you challenge, or if you face a challenge for the first time in your life, you probably don't know what to do. But if you have faced the challenge once and it has actually worked out, so you have caught the Pokemon and it is inscribed in your Pokédex, you can actually, without the problem, do the same thing next time again, and it will all be fine and work out in the end. So if we think about it this way, Pokemon is this call to adventure, is this hero journey, and the hero journey goes into the underworld, so the unknown, or this world of Pokemon, and he is faced with great danger, so every Pokemon could actually kill all his team, and that's the worst thing that could possibly happen in Pokemon. So we have also this aspect of great danger when we dive into the underworld, which is here, obviously, the Pokemon world. All right, then we move on. A little side note. I don't know if anyone has actually done this, or I actually know that some of you have done this, but this is a personality kind of test you can make online, and it's actually based on Carl Jung. So all these archetypical personalities that you get out of those kind of tests are based on Carl Jung's theories of archetypes. So what basically happens is that you fill out a few questions, and then they will tell you what kind of archetype you are. In Jungian theory, that's actually terrible, because the main goal of Carl Jung as a psychoanalyst was to encourage his the people that were looking for help from him to dive into their own unconscious and to assimilate as many different traits of themselves as possible, so that they could fill their Pokédex, to stay within the metaphor of Pokemon. So basically, if you get one of those personalities and you're like clear-cut one of those personalities, it's terrible for your life. You will be able to live your life in this certain, like, in one plane of reality, but there are so many things you're missing out on. So if you're basically very, very nice, you won't know how to handle very bad situations. So if someone's very evil to you, you won't know what to do. So you have to develop this evil side of you too, to confront someone who's evil to you. That is basically the main idea of Jungian theory, and his thought was that you need dreams to dive deeper into your own unconscious to develop these sides of yourself that you're missing. All right, then we move on to intertextuality, the second theme of this lecture. And the main ideas of intertextuality were developed by Julia Kristeva and Roland Barthes. And we will go through this theme by looking at three main quotes from The Death of the Author, which is one of the most important essays written by Roland Barthes, but also one of the most important essays that were written on this theme. All right, we'll start off with a quote from Saracine from Balzac, and the quote goes, "It was woman with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring, and her delicious delicacy of feeling." So we have this situation where this woman is described. This woman is actually a man who was castrated and these female kind of qualities are ascribed to this person. Then Roland Barthes goes on to say, who is speaking in this way? Is it the story's hero concerned to ignore the castrato concealed beneath the woman? Is it the man Balzac endowed by his personal experience with the philosophy of woman? Is it the author Balzac professing certain literary ideas of femininity? Is it universal wisdom or romantic psychology? So here, this is where we are deep in intertextuality. This is the question, who's speaking at one point? And the main idea of intertextuality is that that doesn't really matter. Intertextuality means that a text is a kind of mosaic of a lot of other texts. So you can't really say that anyone's speaking because there are so many texts speaking within a text at once that you should just concern yourself with what you can actually gain from the text. So the reader is in the forefront of who's important by looking at the production of a text. And this is also what he will say in the following passage. It will always be impossible to know for the good reason that our writing is itself this special voice consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. So this is already like, I think, the first page. So Roland Barthes is very quick to get to the point that he wants to get to. So at this point, the author is already non-existent. He doesn't matter anymore, or she. He's already basically dead. But he will go on to develop this idea much further. One of the main ideas he thinks that the author was put into the forefront of writing is that critics, or that is part of the theory, is that critics actually have with the author an authority that they can prove their critique was good. So if you have an author and you can go into his biography and say, this happened and because of that he wrote this, you actually have like a convincing case. But for the text itself, after intertextuality, it doesn't really matter. It's not important. Once the author is gone, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite useless. To give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with a final signification, to close the writing. That is something that intertextuality doesn't want. It doesn't want to enclose a certain meaning or enclose the text itself. It just wants the text to be this mosaic of texts, and you can look at all the strings that are at play. You can look at all the intertexts that are kind of at play at once in the text, but it doesn't matter who wrote it, why he wrote it or anything. It just matters what is actually on the page. This conception perfectly suits criticism, which can then take as its major task the discovery of the author or his hypostasis, society, history, the psyche, freedom, beneath the work. Once the author is discovered, the text is explained. The critic has conquered, hence it is scarcely surprising not only that historically the reign of the author should also have been that of the critic, but that criticism should be overthrown along with the author. This is just stressing the point again, that the author should be overthrown and that the text should be returned to the reader, and the reader is the one who actually decides what is happening. This will also be stressed in this part. In this way is revealed the whole being of writing. A text consists of multiple writings, issuing from several cultures and entering into dialogue with each other, into parody, into contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is collected, united, and this place is not the author, as we have hitherto said it was, but the reader. The reader is the very space in which are inscribed without any being lost all the citations a writing consists of. The unity of a text is not in its origin, it is in its destination. But this destination can no longer be personal. The reader is a man without history, without biography, without psychology. He is only that someone who holds gathered into a single field all the path of which the text is constituted. So in this kind of thinking of intertextuality, a text is not one fixed meaning or one fixed path a text could take, but this unlimited kind of path you could look at if you analyze a text in a way. Although intertextual or people using ideas of intertextuality would probably also take offense at the term analyze because it kind of imposes some kind of authority or meaning to a text. Yeah. We are now beginning to be the dupes no longer of such antiphrases by which our society proudly champions precisely what it dismisses, ignores, smooths, or destroys. We know that to restore to writing its future, we must reverse its myth. The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author. So, as I've already said, the author as an authority figure for the text needs to die, in extreme words, to liberate the reader and give the reader back the force upon the text. So if you're reading a text, it doesn't matter what the author thought while producing it. It matters what you are making of it, what you are working with when you're reading the text. We kind of talked about this when we talked about the interpretation of images, I think. Someone asked if the authority of the painter was like the final authority or something like that. And we discussed quite extensively that within the author there are things at play that the author doesn't need to be aware of. I could talk about Jungian analytical psychology to stress this point again, but I guess all of you kind of got that already from this short introduction. So within the author there are things at play, there are other texts that play a huge role by producing a text, and it's way more interesting to go after these texts or to look at those texts to see what the meaning of the text is or what you can work with when you look at the text. All right, now to the big question, what do those two fields have in common in any way, or why did I choose to present them in this interrelationship? And I think there are many points that I want to make here. To begin with, Jung developed his analytical theory that I've kind of presented with the archetypes, etc., as a dream theory or the interpretation of a dream. So I think that this interpretation of a dream can also be used to look at texts, which I've obviously done by showing you what a Jungian reading of Pokemon would be like. And I think that these two theories have lots in common. For example, archetypes are basically the idea that within your psyche, within your unconscious, there are a lot of voices at play. So if you are faced with a certain situation, your collective unconscious kind of rumbles, and there are so many archetypes trying to tell you what to do. Obviously, you're not aware of this because you're only the conscious aspect of you, but your collective unconscious holds a lot of answers you could use, or that is at least what the theory says. But in a way, you only use those that you have already in your consciousness. But in intertextuality, we have all those voices within a text that are kind of rumbling for authority or kind of rumbling to be noticed or whatever. And I think there's a core similarity here, that your psyche is kind of made up of different voices and that a text also is made up of different voices. Then we can also use the symbolic representation or the symbolism that Carl Jung has worked on extensively to analyze texts. He wrote a lot of essays about different symbols in dreams and how we are to understand them. For example, one of the things that I stumbled upon many times while reading his text was that for him, mandalas are the perfect representation of a human psyche. That for you may sound really weird, but his main idea is basically that a mandala consists of a lot of different pictures that are put together. And in the middle, there's usually in a mandala some kind of circle, or that is at least like this traditional mandala. And this thing in the middle, this circle, is what he thought of was the consciousness, and all around in its different realizations is the different imagery that your mind could possibly come up with. And those are all kind of differentiated by other circles or other structures. So you kind of develop different parts of your psyche and you go around in this mandala as you want. And you could use all the different imagery that is there to some degree to use and to confront the situation. Yeah. All right. And now I'll dive deeper into why I thought those kind of theories can be put together or used to or used together in a way. And first of all, I've kind of demonstrated this by working with Pokemon in a way, but now I'll hit you with more theory that I've thought about while analyzing this. So in a Jungian text theory, we have a mask for the text, which is basically what the author stands for. So if we analyze a text and we use the biography of the author or his social and historical background, we get what this text represents as a persona. So basically what it represents in a social environment, what it represents in relationship to the outer world. But if we dive deeper into the text and dive deeper into the unconscious of the text, we can work our way through the personal unconscious, which would be what the text does within the reader. So if the reader is affected by certain aspects of the text touches this personal aspect of the reader. So it's not the author who is at foreground here anymore, it's the reader who is at foreground anymore. And then there's also the second layer, parallel to the theory of Carl Jung. It's the collective unconscious of the text, and that is obviously the collective background that was put into the text. So if you read a text, for example, I mean, I've put on a lot of examples here of archetypes used within texts. So if we look at Batman, we obviously have Batman as the hero who is representing good and who wants to do all these nice things to help people. And the extreme shadow of his is obviously Joker. But you can also see this correlation of Carl Jung's theory, because Joker is all the things that Batman is not. So you can read narratives or texts in this way, and you can also assign roles. So in a way you have Batman as the hero, and then you have Joker as the trickster and the shadow, obviously. And Joker is also able to shapeshift in a way in that he, in a lot of movies, kind of wears uniforms or impersonates other people and kind of fools other people. There's this like famous scene that just popped into my mind. It's where he's dressed up as a nurse, walks into this like hospital, then talks to the person I don't know the name of, but it's this guard. Harvey Dent, yeah, thank you, yeah. And then walks out and blows up the whole hospital. And all this is only possible because he could shapeshift into this like nurse kind of persona. So I think that if we look at texts with the framework of Carl Jung's theory, we can work out a lot of like psychological background of what's actually going on within the text. I mean, probably no one has thought about Pokemon the way I've just presented it, but I think that reading texts that way could kind of benefit everyone. And that's why I presented it in correlation to one another. All right, now follow-up literature. If anyone's interested, there are a lot of introductions to Carl Jung's theory, but the best one is, as always, to just read him himself. And there are a lot of collected works edition, but also one on the collective unconscious and archetypes, and I would just greatly recommend that because I thought that was really fruitful. All right, that's it.